Welcome. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School. Thank you all for being here today. This topic is one of the most important political issues of our day. And a few months ago, I was reading an article, I believe in the New York Times, about Wendy Young's work and what she was doing with the children who were coming across the border and her humanitarian outreach to them. And I went to Nikolai and said, we've got to get Wendy Young here. Having just spent a visit with her before this program, it is even better than I thought. In fact, I signed up for a capstone program to take 6 months off from the Clinton School. She told me that James Mitchell had already worked out the details, and so I'm going to go. Her work is really nothing short of phenomenal. And this may be one of the most lasting and monumental programs we've ever had here. It certainly is at or near the top of my personal list. So with that, could I please ask if you turn your cell phones and other electronic devices off? To introduce our speaker today as someone who knows the region and area well, Henry Carlin, or I guess we could say Dr. Henry Carlin, Clinton School student, who received his DDS degree from the New York University School of Dentistry. He worked for the National Health Corps. He spent 30 years of private practice doing work in the Caribbean region of the world. At the Clinton School, Henry is working on a project identifying behavioral health service providers in Arkansas. And he has a very, very strong interest in this particular topic. You're in for a great program today. Please welcome Clinton School student, Dr. Henry Carlin.
Good afternoon, Dean Rutherford, esteemed guests, members of the Clinton School family. I am profoundly moved by the opportunity I have today to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Ms. Wendy Young. As president of Kids in Need of Defense, Ms. Young oversees the organization efforts to provide quality and compassionate legal representation to unaccompanied and immigrant children in the United States. By the year 2012, KIND had assisted nearly 5,000 children and developed a network of over 170 law firms, corporate, and law school partners to provide representation for these children. KIND was founded by Angelina Jolie and the Microsoft Corporation in 2009 to create a pro bono movement of law firms, corporations, non-governmental organizations, universities, and volunteers to provide these services. Ms. Young earned a bachelor's degree from Williams College in Massachusetts and a joint law degree and master's in international relations from American University in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining KIND, she served as chief counsel on immigration policy to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Border Security, and Refugees, chaired by the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy. She held prior immigration policy positions with organizations such as the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the Women's Refugee Commission, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the National Council for La Raza. Brevity compels me to forego listing the multiple awards, honors, and professional accolades our guest has earned for her work. For years, she has evinced a ceaseless commitment to advocating for and representing the most vulnerable among us in securing their rights. There is no one who can speak as authoritatively nor educate us as profoundly as she can on this issue. And as the issue of uncontrolled immigration has increasingly dominated public discourse and become a driving political controversy, my personal concern has been the loss of clarity and the ongoing objectification of the souls that Ms. Young reaches out to. They have unwittingly become a public issue while we have lost track of who they really are, which is children. We need to take a long look at our own moral compass, and I fear what this loss of compassion implies about our own hearts. It is with profound respect that I introduce Ms. Wendy Young.
Thank you. And thank you to Henry, Dean Rutherford, and the Clinton School for inviting me to join you today. It's quite the honor to be here, and I've learned quite a bit about your programs over the past few hours, and just very impressed with the school and all that it does. So, in case you didn't hear, a few kids arrived at our border this summer, and we've been a little busy. I'll get back to that immediate crisis, but wanted to start just by more broadly introducing you to the issue of unaccompanied immigrant and refugee children. When I often speak in settings like this, and I tell people that thousands of children arrive at the border of the United States each year seeking protection, I get a lot of kind of puzzled looks. People do not expect children to be on the move alone around the world, and I think it truly is a red flag when a child has been forced to leave their family, their communities, and then to start crossing international borders in search of protection and safety. Technically, unaccompanied children under U.S. immigration laws are kids who are under age 18 who arrive at the border not accompanied by a parent or legal guardian. They may be traveling with another family member. Very, very often they're traveling with a smuggler or a trafficker. Some are traveling in groups of kids, and some are truly alone. Next question I often get asked is, well, why are they coming here? Well, they come for every story of every one of these children is completely unique, but they come typically fleeing war, human rights abuses, domestic violence in their homes, fleeing severe economic deprivation, and some are coming because they do, in fact, have a family member in the United States already, and they're seeking to reunify with that family member. So what happens when a child arrives at our border? Well, in the old days, they were treated just as an adult. The immigration authorities, in the old days it was the Immigration Naturalization Service, I'm dating myself, would take the child into custody and literally detain them in juvenile jails. And they would be held while we considered whether they should be deported from the United States or not. Under changes made to our laws when the Department of Homeland Security was created under the Homeland Security Act of 2003, we successfully persuaded Congress that children are different and that children should not be detained in the same way as adults, but instead should be under the care, custody, and placement services of the Department of Health and Human Services, and within that, something called the Office of Refugee Resettlements. We successfully made that change in 2003. Fast forwarding in 2008 to the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, an act that got a lot of attention in this summer's media called the TVPRA. Children were also provided services to care for them, and it was mandated that children be released to family members whenever possible if they had a family member in the United States. So, what does my organization do? Just very briefly. We address one of those service needs of these children in particular. We facilitate the volunteer legal representation of children in their deportation proceedings. And as Henry mentioned in the introduction, we do this in partnership with major law firms, corporate legal departments, and law schools across the country. We're now up to 220 of those partners, and we've trained over 8,000 volunteer lawyers across the country to represent the children in their proceedings. It's an incredible, incredible volunteer movement in the legal community. We also run a project in Guatemala for children who are ordered deported or voluntarily decide to return home, to help them return and reintegrate into their communities, because typically when kids are deported from the United States, the Department of Homeland Security will transport them back to the home country and then literally leave them at the airport in the country of origin, with the assumption that it is then that home country government's responsibility to care for the child. But of course, most of these kids are coming from very, very poor countries with very weak or no child welfare systems. So the kids are really left to fend on their own. So we help them reintegrate into their family, their community, and provide them whatever follow-up services they need. And finally, we do advocacy in Washington, D.C., with the White House, with Congress, with the federal agencies that have jurisdiction over these children's cases, to try and make the system as child-friendly as it can possibly be. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn to what happened this summer. And share with you from my perspective as somebody who's been working on these issues since 1989, what exactly happened. First of all, I think the starting point for understanding the situation is to understand that actually the numbers of unaccompanied children arriving in the United States actually began to tick up in October 2011. At first, those of us in the NGO community who work with these kids and our counterparts in government were like, interesting, this has to be some kind of aberration, the numbers will settle back down. Well, in fact, they never did settle back down. And every month from October 2011 until this summer, the numbers went up and up and up. Even during the summer months, when the numbers typically drop fairly dramatically because people don't want to travel during the hot summer months, the numbers kept going up. So we started to reach out to the federal agencies, the White House, and say, I think we have a problem here. But basically, for a whole lot of reasons, the problem went unaddressed. And part of that, and I'll get back to this, was because the focus for the past several years has really been on the larger immigration reform effort. So what happened this spring, starting in May, was that the system that was set up for these children basically imploded. It is a system of care and custody that was designed for an average of 6,000 to 8,000 children a year. And by January of 2014, we were forecasting that 60,000 or more children would be coming in over the course of the fiscal year. So a tenfold increase. So the Department of Health and Human Services, which had built shelter care programs, which, as a footnote, are really detention centers, these are locked facilities to care for these children, they simply did not have the bed space to care for the children at the rate that they were arriving. When things are happening the way they're supposed to, Border Patrol, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, is the agency that actually picks these children up at the border. They are statutorily limited in how long they can hold the child, to under 72 hours before they're required to transfer them to Health and Human Services. Because HHS did not have the bed space, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, could not make those transfers. So the children started to pile up at the Border Patrol stations, particularly in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And these are very minimal facilities. They're jail-like in their environment, and they're basically there to process people as they're apprehended coming across the border. They're not in any way intended to care for children. So what you saw were these kids piling up at the Border Patrol stations. At one point, it was so crowded, the children could not lie down to sleep. They had to take turns sleeping. There was no food for these children. Typically, people that are stopped at the Border Patrol stations are fed something like McDonald's, fast food. These kids were being held in these facilities for up to 12 days. Very minimal health care was provided. There weren't even the toilet facilities for these children. So the toilets started overflowing. So basically what we saw was a breakdown in the system, and the Border Patrol itself realized it had a problem and leaked photos to the media of the conditions inside the facility. And this is where my life changed overnight, because suddenly the American public, who was not aware of who these kids are, didn't even know really that children do move on their own, was like, wait a minute, what's happening at our border? At the same time, the numbers kept increasing and increasing. At one point, there were as many as 600 children arriving at the border every day, and Border Patrol had to find some place to house them. ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the custodial agency, couldn't keep pace, could not open up shelter care space fast enough to keep up with these numbers. So finally, President Obama declared the situation to be a humanitarian situation and charged FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to take over the program. And that's when you saw the kids being housed on military bases, particularly Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, Fort Sills in Oklahoma, and Ventura Naval Base in California. And these were facilities that were set up very, very rapidly to accommodate the children. So again, better than the Border Patrol stations, but certainly not what you would like to see being in place for children. What also happened during this time was a very concerted effort to politicize this issue. The issue very quickly became conflated with the overall public debate around immigration reform and whether the undocumented should be provided some kind of legal status and right to remain in the United States. So those that oppose that effort pointed at the border situation and said, see, President Obama's soft on immigration, he's lost control of the borders. When he provided relief to the DREAM Act children, this is what happens. He attracted more children to come to the United States. That, in turn, I think, made the administration extremely nervous because, of course, it is an ongoing goal and a priority for this administration to do administrative relief for the undocumented. So the White House started messaging that they needed to send a deterrent message back to the home countries. And these children are primarily coming from 3 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And they suggested that the way to send that deterrent message was to turn the kids right around at the border and send them home. This then got us very upset. We were hanging with the administration throughout this crisis, recognizing, for example, that they had to use the military bases. But when that messaging started coming out, we started to say, no, it's important to understand why these children are coming to the United States in the first place, that this is more about push factors in Central America than it is about pull factors, such as immigration reform. Because the reality is, Central America is one of the most dangerous places in the world right now. Honduras is the murder capital of the world, and El Salvador and Guatemala are on the list of top 6. It is more dangerous in Honduras than it is in the Middle East currently. That violence is being caused by very organized cartels. These are narco-trafficking cartels that are partnering with gangs on the ground and basically taking over communities in these 3 countries. And they are specifically and very viciously targeting children to try and co-opt the children and their families into condoning or actively engaging in the criminal behavior with them. So families, and again, these are countries with very weak systems of governance and very weak law enforcement. So families in these countries are making the most desperate choice that a family could make and sending their children out alone in the world. And literally families have said to us, I would rather see my child die on the way to the United States than die on my back doorstep. So this is fundamentally a refugee crisis. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the guardian of international refugee law, in fact did an assessment of the Central American situation and interviewed over 400 of the unaccompanied children and concluded that 58% of the children, in fact, should be considered for international protection. And having been somebody who worked for UNHCR, that is the closest the UN will ever come to saying this is a refugee crisis. This is not an immigration issue. The administration also pointed, and many in Congress, to the fact that that smugglers were taking advantage of these children, and that is something that we cannot deny. Interestingly and sadly, the smugglers are actually very much connected to the exact same cartels that are organizing the violence in the home countries. So they're further capitalizing on the movement of these children by charging them extraordinarily high amounts of money to transport them to the U.S. border. And these gangs also exploit the children along the way. What we have seen is a huge increase, for example, in the rate of sexual violence against girls who are migrating. And, by the way, 40% of the children migrating currently are girls. In the old days, it was 25%. Where do we stand today? Well, there was obviously a media frenzy over the course of the summer, and for us in the advocacy community, it became an opportunity to educate people about what was happening. And I think half glass full for us, we did see a building in support for, okay, these are children first and foremost, and we as the United States can step up and offer these children protection, offer them an opportunity to share their story. Then in August, the numbers started to drop fairly dramatically, down from an average of about 400 to 450 per day. Currently, there are about 60 children arriving per day. And the issue went off the headlines, which in a way was a good thing, in that there was less kind of frenzied political activity around the issue. But I will say it's left us with a bit of a new crisis, because now we're in not a border crisis situation, we're in a due process crisis. Because all of those children who arrived over the summer are still in deportation proceedings. So the administration, again, with the goal of sending a deterrent message back to the home countries, decided to prioritize the adjudication of unaccompanied children's cases, who used to be literally at the lowest rung of the priority list, are now the first priority. So they instructed the immigration courts, which are administered by the Department of Justice, to put the kids at the front of the line for adjudication, and to do the first hearing within 21 days of the case being filed. The immigration courts, which is a highly decentralized system, some of the immigration judges have interpreted that even further. Not only are they doing the first hearing within a matter of days, they're instructing the child at that first hearing to come back within a week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, and be sure to have an attorney, and by the way, be sure to have filed your asylum claim. Well, this is where we come in. And I can tell you, it is impossible to prepare a child's case in a 1, 2, 3 week, even in a 3-month time window. Fundamentally, first of all, these kids are depending on volunteer attorneys. We have to find the volunteer and match the attorney with that child. Secondly, these are attorneys who are in major law firms. They have to do a conflicts check to make sure that there's some reason they can't represent the child. Normally those conflict checks turn out just fine, but you're required to do that in a law firm. That takes usually a few weeks. And then most importantly, your child, your client is a child. You have to spend hours and hours of time with each child to develop the kind of trust and rapport so that that child feels comfortable opening up to you and sharing your story. And then you have to write your brief and do all the other paperwork required. So this is impossible for children to get a fair hearing within a matter of weeks. So what's the result of that? 70% of the children are currently going through their deportation proceedings. And this is in a very formal courtroom setting with a robed immigration judge, Department of Homeland Security trial attorney who's the prosecutor arguing for the child's release. 70% of those children are appearing before that judge, arguing against that trial attorney with no lawyer by their side. I have been in courtrooms and seen 5-year-olds appear before immigration judges without a lawyer. And this particular case has always stuck in my head. I was just observing the Baltimore Immigration Court one day, visiting with my Baltimore office. And it was a chaotic scene. Dozens of kids running around, some with family members, some without, a handful of lawyers. The immigration judge calls the case, and up walks a 5-year-old girl. She's about this tall. And she's wearing her a little red, like, party dress, little Ugg boots, and she's carrying a doll. So the judge calls her up, and she sits behind the respondent's table, and she couldn't see over the microphone. And the judge proceeds to try to ask her questions about, why are you in the United States? And I suspect that child doesn't even know what a border is. And that child couldn't answer those questions. So finally the judge says to her, you need to find a lawyer. Kind's in the back of the room. Talk to that lady, meaning my staff, not me, thank God. And she'll try to find you a lawyer. So the little girl got up from the respondent's table, and the judge says to her in Spanish, what's the name of your doll? And she responded in Spanish, baby, baby doll. And that was the only answer she gave at that entire hearing. So fast forwarding 2 years, we've matched her with a private sector attorney from a law firm. They spent a lot of time with her. And she eventually was granted something called special immigrant juvenile status, which is for kids who've been deemed to have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. I later asked my staff member, what was it like to work with a child 5 years old? And she said, a lot of Play-Doh and a lot of candy. And if kids are not represented by counsel, they only have a 10% chance of winning their case. If they are represented by counsel, they're 5 times more likely to obtain some form of protection, which means they get to remain in the U.S., which underscores fundamentally that, that in this case, I look at legal representation as a form of humanitarian assistance. Because these children literally will be sent back to very dangerous situations, sometimes maybe even life-threatening situations, if somebody's not there by their side to help them tell their story. I'm going to segue off that for a second and just say that part of our advocacy on this issue this summer is also to try and raise awareness that this isn't actually just a U.S. problem. This isn't a border crisis. It was actually a regional crisis. Asylum application rates in countries like Panama and Costa Rica are actually up 712% because of people fleeing these 3 sending countries. So part of what we've also been encouraging the U.S. government to do is support those countries and help them build their asylum systems so that these kids and their families can access protection in the surrounding region and don't have to always make that very, very difficult, very dangerous trip across Mexico to reach our border. Right now, we're quite concerned because instead of doing that, the U.S. government has been supporting countries in the region in their efforts to intercept people, particularly Mexico, as they're trying to cross the country and turning them around and sending them right back home. And only 119 people applied for asylum in Mexico last year. We're now hearing reports that as many as 30 to 70,000 Central Americans may have been interdicted on their way here. So in other words, we've got a problem that's developing not on our border, but another border down. We also understand that the government of Honduras is actually turning its own citizens around at its border and sending them home before they even cross in. Finally, what I'm going to end with, and this is a long-term solution, but I fundamentally believe it's the solution to this whole crisis, which we don't know if it's over yet or not, but we need to look at the root causes of why these children are coming to the United States to begin with. We need to put the Americas back in our foreign policy. We need to help governments in the region, not only in their law enforcement efforts to crack down on narco-trafficking and gangs, but just as important, to invest in human development, to create child welfare systems, to create education systems, create healthcare systems, so that children truly have a true and viable option to remain at home in their home country and don't have to make this dangerous journey to the United States. I'm one of the few immigration advocates you'll ever hear who says, the kind of immigration I work on is not a good thing. Children should not have to move out of their homes, out of their communities, and across international borders in search of safety. But finally, I will also end with this. For those children who do make it to the United States, these kids are not a threat to us. In fact, if anything, they're an asset. A few months ago, every year we do a big gala in New York, a fundraiser, and this year we asked 4 young people who had been granted status to share their experiences with people who attended the gala. We did not script them in any way, we just asked them to talk about their experiences. But without fail, these 4 young people ended with, I'm so glad to be in the United States, I'm so glad to be able to get an education. And they talked about they wanted to go into communications, they wanted to go into computer technology, they wanted to go into architecture. They had hopes, they had aspirations. These are kids who've learned what it is like to live in a world where they have nothing and where they fear everything. And when they come here, they are eager to learn, they're eager to be part of our society, and they thrive. So I will end on that note. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, we got questions? Yes, sir.
Were there, I had heard that there were papers in Central and South America that had put advertisement in enticing these children to come. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, there's some truth in that, and radio ads was the other thing. That is basically the smugglers at work. The smugglers are very adept at this, and they're very good businessmen in a very evil kind of business. So not only are those same kind of, again, criminal cartels creating the danger in the home countries, they then make money off of the kids and families who want to migrate. So they start propagandizing. And they'll say, for example, one of the things that came out over the summer was there's something called the notice to appear, which is basically the charging document that an individual receives saying, we're putting you into deportation proceedings and you're required to show up in immigration court while we sort your situation out. They called those notices to appear permisos. The smugglers did, and what they meant by that was you get to the United States and they give you your piece of paper and that means you're free, when in fact it's just the opposite. So smugglers are very good at manipulating this situation, and they're making a lot of money off of it.
Let me ask you a question. What do you think after the election President Obama is going to do on the immigration issue?
Well, obviously, he made a speech in the Rose Garden end of July saying that he did want to, through executive action, grant the right to remain to the undocumented population, and of course that created quite the backlash. Initially, the signals were that he would do that right after Labor Day. He clearly did not do that, and he did then say, I'm going to wait until after the midterms because of some of the tough re-elections, including one in this state. So he's waited until after the midterms. He's still under, obviously, a lot of pressure to grant that status, and there's expectations that he will do so. I do fear that, depending on the outcome of the election, that could dramatically either change his mind completely or limit how far he goes with that initiative. I think one thing that's absolutely guaranteed is if he does do something, then again, he's going to get a lot of heat for it, and from Congress, and could go as far as, pushing forward on the call for impeachment, that he's doing something unconstitutional. I also fear that our issue, my unaccompanied children's issue, could get pulled back into that debate because well, again,
with voices like you, I would imagine you'll be advocating that.
We'll be pushing
I have no doubt about that. Yeah. Before I recognize the next speaker, I want to introduce her. If you're the voice for people without support or a base in America, the person getting ready to ask this question is State Senator Joyce Elliott, who represents those folks in Arkansas and does an incredible job. She is an Arkansas hero on this issue as well as that. Senator Elliott, your question.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm not clear on the federal law on trafficking, and in Arkansas last year we went a long way toward passing some really good legislation on human trafficking.
Right.
To what extent does that intersect with the immigration of these children? Is there any way we can use that law to be helpful? Anything we can do at the state level?
Yeah, sure, and I'll answer that in 3 pieces. First of all, some of the children that we work with have in fact been trafficked. So they may be eligible for what's known as the T visa for victims of trafficking. So that's one component of our work. I do fear that there are a lot of trafficked children who cross the border, are undetected, and end up in very terrible circumstances here. the laws protecting unaccompanied children are part of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. But the reason it's in there, the protections go beyond trafficked children. The reasons they're in the TVPRA was that was a good vehicle for us to attach them to in 2008. I was actually working in the Senate when that happened. It was like, this is a bill that's got huge bipartisan support. Only 2 members voted against it. We know unaccompanied children are related to it and also have protection needs of their own, so we actually folded another piece of legislation into the TVPRA. The third piece, what can states do? Thank you for your leadership, and I think the states are becoming a very critical player in the immigration issue. California, just last week, Governor Brown signed legislation that for the first time will allocate state funding for legal representation of unaccompanied children. We're very excited by this. So the states can play a very, I think, positive and influential role, and I think also politically, it sends a signal that many parts of the United States do, in fact, support immigration. So, thank you.
Wendy, before I recognize the next speaker, let me introduce him, just as I introduced the political hero of the immigration world in Arkansas. Let me introduce the medical hero of the immigration. Dr. Eddie Ochoa with Arkansas Children's Hospital has treated more immigrant children than any doctor in Arkansas, and he is a real hero too.
Wow.
Dr. Ochoa, your question.
Oh, thank you very much, Skip. That was very kind. And thank you for your presentation. I think the headlines over the summer, as you mentioned, were all about unaccompanied minors, but in fact, there are lots of family units, women and children mostly, some men that came across the border as well. Along with a group from NYU, I visited the Artesia Detention Center in July. And what struck me was that of the 650 women and children in that center, the average age of the child was 6.
Right.
So we had lots of women walking around the center in the middle of the desert with babies. And we know now in the last week that the Carlin Center in Texas is having problems with the organization that's running it. So how do you contrast the situation with the unaccompanied minors with the family units and have those women done any better in our system?
No, thank you for bringing that up. We work very closely with organizations that are very focused on the treatment of the families, and the issues are obviously very interconnected. What's happened is the families were treated differently than the unaccompanied children because of the difference in the laws. So families can be detained and screened for protection on a very expedited basis and immediately turned around from the detention center if they don't meet that screening. Whereas children, unaccompanied children that is, have to be admitted into the U.S. to pursue their case in immigration court. And that was a recognition because they're alone that there was a unique vulnerability there. We're very concerned about the conditions in the family detention centers. And first of all, before the summer crisis, they had almost eliminated the detention of families completely. There's one tiny facility in Pennsylvania, and that was it. Because of this, and because the law allowed them to detain families, they dramatically ramped up their family detention space, and there's now going to be 3 facilities online very shortly with a total bed space, I believe, somewhere around 4,000. So a huge increase. And the conditions are horrific, particularly for children. And you would know much better than I, but I'm hearing stories of kids in those facilities experiencing tremendous weight loss, illnesses, reactions to the food that they're being fed. And so when you think about it, if you're a family being jailed together, this just shouldn't happen. And on top of that, there has been, and I give the administration great credit for this, there has been some testing of alternatives to detention for immigrants who are in proceedings, releasing them under, requiring them to come in and report periodically. So we've been encouraging the administration to look at alternatives to detention as something that they could use for these families.
Yes, I have a question right there. Yes. Wait for the microphone, we'll get to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for all the work you're doing. I was wondering what happens to unaccompanied kids who get protection or status. Do they have to show that they have someone who will take care of them, or some custodial person, or some agency, or they just granted status and that's it?
Sure. 90% of the children, in fact, have a family member here. So very often part of our legal representation of the child is to establish a formal legal guardianship for that family member, unless they're a parent, in which case they obviously don't need it. So for the other 10%, if they're granted status, and I don't know the statistics on this, but I suspect few of those 10% are granted status because they're detained throughout the immigration proceeding, which can take months and months, if not years. And most kids don't want to be locked up that long. So what they do is they give up and they go home. So we do see some of those kids in our Guatemala project. But having said that, if they are granted status and they truly do not have a family member in the United States who's able to care for them, they go into federal foster care, which is also administered through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. A few may end up in state foster care. It depends. It's a very complicated area of the law, but it depends on what kind of status you get. So.
Sarah, you got a question back here?
So obviously the long-term goal, looking at those root causes, that's the ideal. But for those children that we do in the long term see still coming, is the goal that we have enough legal representation to best care for them, or is the goal to transform that process so that they're not looking at a court date that's somehow we've adjusted the system to care for children?
It's both. We're really advocating that the judges have to allow the child time to find counsel and prepare their case. So that's an immediate goal. Long-term goal is to ensure that there's federal funding in place to support legal representation. We're making progress on that, I will say. Under the TVPRA, the Health and Human Services is charged with facilitating the provision of pro bono representation to children when they can. So there's been some funding available since 2008 to groups like mine to work with the legal community to create pro bono. More recently, under this administration, they have very strategically decided to try funding what we call direct representation of children. In other words, pay for an NGO attorney who then provides free representation to the child. This is new, it's very revolutionary, and it is extremely controversial. So this is an issue that in immigration reform, we expect is going to come up. Some of you may know that the Senate actually passed its form of immigration reform last year, and it was a pretty solid piece of legislation. That actually included a provision that mandated that the government pay for counsel for unaccompanied children. Now that the visibility of the issue is so heightened, I don't expect, sadly, that that would survive if we get back to legislation.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Young, again for coming to see us today at the Clinton School. My question is in regards to if the GOP is to win the House and the Senate this fall, do you think that they will be more supportive of President Obama's decision to do executive action on immigration reform if they are to seriously win the White House in 2016?
I think they need to wake up. You know, clearly the demographics are changing in this country, and it's not just Latinos. It's actually, the Asian immigrant community is actually growing faster than the Latino immigrant community. A lot of people don't realize that. And this is a party that's really dragged its heels on immigration reform. So I will be interested to see, A, where those midterms take us, and how much traction they get in their campaigns on the immigration issue, because I think that could set the dynamic for the next 2 years. But then how are they going to pivot and turn for 2016? You know, the clock is ticking. So we'll see. And then don't tell anyone I'm a 501c3, because I never should have answered that question.
Dean DePeppa.
Excuse me, thank you for being here. I'm interested in your distinction between direct representation and pro bono. I started my career in legal services.
Great.
I know how controversial that is.
Right.
But specifically, what can law schools do, and how do you work with them?
Sure, yeah. We have some great partnerships with over 20 law schools in our 8 cities. Give you one example, a new initiative that we just launched at the beginning of this year. Columbia Law School now hosts my office in New York, We facilitate externships for Columbia Law students so that they go inside a major New York law firm to support that law firm on working on a kind case. So the student gets that kind of double advantage of experiencing what it's like to work inside a law firm. At the same time, they get to work on a public interest law case. And the law firm gets the free help from the student, and we get all the added value of having that extra manpower behind the case, woman power. So we're doing that sort of thing across the country. In addition, what's interesting is under supervision, law students can actually represent people in immigration court. Immigration courts are the one judicial system I know of, at least in the United States, where you don't necessarily have to be a lawyer to practice. It's not something we do, because I believe the combination of working on an immigration case and working with a child, you really should be a barred attorney. So we don't do it, but just so you know that. But we love our partnerships with the law schools.
Well, listen, I know we could go on forever. Wendy's got, first of all, Nicolai's got her NPR interview that we've got to do, and I know that several of the students have come up to me and wanted to ask questions privately to her. So I will tell you, this is a great program, and I'm really proud that you would come to the Clinton School, Wendy, to be a part of it. Let's give Wendy a thank you.